Kicking off at number 5, the witches' well. And whilst Europe as a whole has had a long tragic line of witch hunting throughout its long and bloody history, there is perhaps one location in Scotland that exemplifies that period more so than any other. Edinburgh Castle is a hive of activity, a beautiful structure that speaks of the city's ancient roots and its mystical origin, but as you walk around its high walls, you'd may be amiss to know that you're walking amongst the same ground of a brutal and horrifying massacre that stretched out over a century. Now, the witches' well, a cast iron fountain and plaque, honours the Scottish people who were burned at the stake at Edinburgh Castle between the 15th and 18th centuries. But it was the 16th century and one king in particular where the witches' well saw more bloodshed than anywhere else in Scotland. King James VI and I of Scotland and England respectively was certainly an intriguing figure throughout British history, but it was his unique brand of zealotry that led to the deaths of thousands of innocent women, each of them without a trial. King James believed that witchcraft was a form of Satanism and that anyone who possessed the abilities that he perceived as mystical, be it herbology or even dancing, were in fact possessed by the devil himself. You see, King James was obsessed with the notion of witchcraft and would write countless literature about demonology, but all of this culminated in a period that ran throughout the 17th and 18th centuries at Edinburgh Castle. As a result, more than 4,000 alleged witches, nearly all of them female, were mercilessly put to death. In fact, so many of them were brutally murdered that the usual act of burning at the stake was replaced with routine hanging, the last of which took place in 1728. During this horrifying satanic panic, pretty much anyone and everyone could be unrightfully accused of practicing black magic. Many of those that were killed were keen herbalists demonstrating an ancient practice of medicine. Some of them were mentally ill and wrongfully deemed possessed, and even rarer, some of those killed were merely on the wrong end of someone else's malice, murdered over a squabble. It was a brutal time not only in Scottish history but the entirety of the British Isles, and the witches' well at Edinburgh Castle stands as a monument, a mortal reminder of those vile deeds. Swinging in at number 4, SKARA BRAE. And to be honest, I just love saying that name, SKARA BRAE. SKARA BRAE. Feels good under the tongue, right? Well, the thing is, for this entry on our list, we're going to be going back pretty far. In fact, further back than any other entry in Scottish history, and perhaps even further back than any other historical instance imaginable, really. SKARA BRAE is a location far, far older than Stonehenge and far older than even the Great Pyramids of Giza themselves, and it's tucked on a series of little islands just off the coast of Scotland, Orkney. Europe's most complete ancient Neolithic village, which, whilst being completely and utterly amazing in itself, may also be evidence of a far more terrifying event than any of us could have ever imagined. You see, there is a reason why SKARA BRAE is often called the Scottish Pompeii, because although it is remarkably preserved in a similar fashion to the ancient Italian volcanic city, it also seems to be evidence of a similar sort of disaster. Back in the winter of 1850, a severe storm battered Scotland, causing immense damage to the populace and over 200 deaths. In the Bay of Scale within the Orkney Isles, the storm stripped away a mass of earth, and when the storm cleared, the nearby villagers were astounded to find the outline of an ancient village. Although the local Laird William Watt of Scale conducted an excavation, it wasn't until 1927 that the actual location was fully excavated, which would take another 60 or so years to be completed. Originally, it was thought that the site was from around 500 BC, but when radiocarbon samples were fully tested, it was revealed that SKARA BRAE was built by at least 3180 BC. Now, as there is evidence of the inhabitants of SKARA BRAE being taken by surprise and fleeing the site in a hurry, such as remains of choice meats being cooked on the fire left behind, and evidence of one woman fleeing in such haste that her necklace broke as she tried to squeeze through the narrow doorway of her home. Now, while SKARA BRAE is still very much a mystery, the leading theory is that the disaster in question was another equally terrifying storm, the same kind that unearthed it in 1850. If that's the case, I think we should be on the lookout for a storm. Next up at number 3, the Massacre of Glencoe. And this one in particular has been immortalised in countless fictional works, paying homage to a terrifying and bloodthirsty event in Scottish history. But as is the case with many things, the truth of this historical instance is full of far more horror than in fiction. Now, the Jacobite uprising was a particularly complex and brutal time in the history of the British Isles, but the worst of it culminated in the Scottish Highlands. After losing the throne of England and Scotland to William III in March of 1689, after landing in Ireland in an attempt to regain the throne, James II and VII recruited a small force of Highlanders to support him in his campaign through Scotland. Now, it's important to note that many Scottish clans have remained loyal to King James, the most profound of which were the MacGregors, the Keppoch MacDonalds, and of course the Glencoe MacDonalds. And keep that name in mind. You see, the thing is, in August of 1691, the government had offered an indemnity to all Scottish chiefs, as long as they swore an oath of allegiance before New Year's Day, January the 1st, 1682. In total, the Secretary of State at the time, Lord Stair, offered a total of £12,000 British for swearing their allegiance to King William, which, as you may imagine, was quite the allure for many other Jacobite-leaning chieftains. On top of that, letters of fire and sword were sent out authorising savage attacks on anyone that would not comply to the order, and interestingly enough, it worked. Pretty much all of the Scottish chiefs took the oath. However, Chief Alexander MacDonald of Glencoe wasn't so sure, and he had postponed his submission of the oath until December 31st, 1691. You see, at the time he was hosting 120 men of the Earl of Argyll, and he wouldn't be able to make it to the nearest magistrate of Fort William until January the 6th. Hearing that news, King William ordered swift punishment to the MacDonalds, and the next moment, over 100 of the Earl's soldiers, who had been quartered amicably at Glencoe for more than a week, suddenly turned and attacked the MacDonalds mercilessly. 33 men, 2 women and 2 children were slaughtered by their own guests, who had been fed and watered and entertained without a second thought. And now we can sort of understand the importance of hospitality, can't we? Hopefully. Coming in at number 2, the Black Dinner. And if that previous entry sounds like something straight out of Game of Thrones, then that's because George R.R. Martin was pretty damn inspired by British history, particularly the history of Scotland. And while this one instance in particular may well seem pretty damn familiar, but that also doesn't make it any less terrifying, because like I said, history is far more horrifying than fiction, because the Black Dinner actually happened. Let's take it back to the year of 1440, a tumultuous time in Scottish history during the reign of King James II, who was just 10 years old at the time. You see, Scotland was under the shaky yet tentative power share and regent rulership of 2 men, Sir Alexander Livingston and Sir William Crichton. It was the second period of regency in a short space of time after King James I was also briefly under the same sort of stewardship. You see, one of those previous regent stewards was a man named Archibald Douglas, 4th Earl of Douglas, who was an all-around pretty decent guy, so much so that in this story you could consider him to be Ned Stark. You see, by the 15th century, the Douglases had become so powerful and damn honourable that some schemers such as Livingston and Crichton saw their family as a threat to the stability of the nation. In 1440, the grandson of Archibald, the 16-year-old William Douglas, 6th Earl of Douglas, was invited to Edinburgh Castle for a spectacular feast alongside his younger brother David. The two of them were invited to dine beside the 10-year-old King James II, and on November 24th, 1440, the small Douglas entourage had arrived. According to legend, the banquet was held in the Great Hall of Edinburgh Castle, and the young king was completely enamoured by the charming and noble Douglases. At the end of the feast though, after the hall went silent, the head of a black bull was brought out on a platter and paraded in front of them. Under ancient Scottish custom, the head of a black bull was the symbol of death, and in rare customary moments, this formality presaged the death of the principal guests of a feast. As the legend goes, King James II was alleged to have pleaded for the lives of his new friends and for the Douglases to be spared, but it is said that his pleas fell on deaf ears, even as king. Both William Douglas and David Douglas were beheaded in front of the then 10-year-old king. And finally, coming in at number 1 spot, Sawney Bean. Because talking of dinner, we certainly can't make this list without featuring perhaps the most notoriously grim instance of folklore in Scottish history, the legend of Sawney Bean. Now also, whilst this entry is potentially the most gruesome in the whole of Scottish history, it's also important to note that not all of the legend of Sawney Bean can be historically verified, and the vast majority of it is resigned to the whisperings of folklore. It's just food for thought. Sorry, I'll stop talking about food now. You see, little is known about the early life of the notorious Sawney Bean, but it is said that he may have been born in East Lothian sometime in the late 16th century. When he reached adulthood, he became a ditch digger, but it seemed that the life of honest labour was not for him. He left home with a, and I quote, a vicious woman named Agnes Douglas, who apparently shared Sawney's inclination for ferocity after being accused of being a witch. On the way, they'd rob anyone that crossed their path, and this is where their first taste for a far more sinister crime began to establish itself. It is said that on the road, Sawney and Agnes cannibalized one of their victims. Eventually the couple settled in a coastal cave, a place hidden just beneath BRAE Head between Girvan and Ballantrae, where they lived undiscovered for over 25 years. As the legend goes, the cave that they made their home was 200 yards deep, and the entrance was completely blocked by water during high tide. And if that sounds like the perfect place to establish an incestuous tribe of cannibals, then that's because it was. You see, Bean and Agnes produced 8 sons, 6 daughters, 18 grandchildren and 14 granddaughters, the majority of which were the produce of incest between their children. At the height of their terrifying reign, the Bean clan would carefully lay ambushes on the nearby road at night to rob and murder individuals or small groups. Their bodies, stripped and picked clean, would be brought back to the cave where they were eaten. Leftovers were pickled in barrels or dried like jerky. One night, however, after trying to ambush a newly married couple, the Bean clan met their match and the young groom fought them with a pistol and sword in combat. Eventually their secret cave was routed and the Bean clan was captured and executed. Now, the actual details of which are down to wild speculation, but one thing is for certain: the cannibal clan of Sawney Bean was said to have murdered and eaten over 1,000 victims. Oh, and also one version of the legend states that the tribe were never actually captured, and the nearby townsfolk were too terrified to go into the cave, so they just blew it up with dynamite. And I don't know about you, but that sounds like a sequel to me.
Number 5 on this list is what I'm going to be nicknaming the Scottish Witch from the Woods. I stumbled across a Scottish story about a witch where they were unable to discover her name. Hundreds of years ago, when Scotland was still being first developed, there was a village in the north of the country. This village was positioned directly next to a forest that they wanted to chop down and expand into. When they began their process of chopping down the forest, a witch, or the Witch of the Woods, came out and warned them that if they continued, she would curse their entire community. The women would become infertile, the crops would never grow, and people would go missing. Fearing for their safety, the group came to an agreement with this witch, where they were allowed to chop down a small section of the forest in exchange for leaving 1 sack every harvest of grain or produce by the edge of the forest. This agreement held true for quite a while until the community started to get less fearful and more greedy. They decided to go against this witch and chop down the rest of the forest without fear of consequence. When the witch came out of the forest again to address their betrayal, they refused to listen, and they hung her immediately. Right before she was executed though, she said that the new price was 3 bags of grain. This fell on deaf ears though, except for one fearful farmer that decided to heed the warning for a little while. The community went on thriving until once again that farmer's fear was replaced with greed. He stopped delivering the grain, and that very same day his youngest daughter went missing. The community looked everywhere, but nobody could find her until somebody checked the mill. Through the bricks and all over the walls, blood started dripping down to the ground, and they knew exactly where his daughter went. That mill has since been torn down, but it was replaced with a silo, and to this day, the locals in that area still think that that silo is haunted by the Scottish Witch in the Woods. Number 4 on this list goes to the Paisley Witches. The Paisley Witches are actually nicknamed after the town of Paisley in Scotland, where these witches were based. Christian Shaw was an 11-year-old girl who was the daughter of a higher up in the Scottish community. It was this 11-year-old girl who fell victim to the curse of several witches. It started with a deep sickness that manufactured itself like any other: fevers, chills, exhaustion. But some reports say that it became much more than that. The story goes that Shaw on one occasion levitated from her bed, and on another occasion started chanting some deep curse. It was clear to everybody involved, including Shaw, that some form of Scottish witchcraft was afoot. Now, she made it evident that she believed multiple witches were involved in causing her ailment, 7 of them in fact. A trial was held for these witches where it was discovered that they all had the witch's mark, or the devil's mark as some like to call it, on their bodies. After this evidence came to light, the jury's decision was easy and all of the witches were sentenced to death. Now, this story was a long time ago, and it's hard to know for certain whether these individuals had anything to do with Shaw's ailment and witchcraft, or if they were wrongly accused, tried improperly, and the story has been exaggerated over time, which frankly is not unlike other potential witch stories during this period. The only thing that we can say for certain though is that the people back then and the 11-year-old Christian Shaw believed wholeheartedly that this group of Paisley witches was just that: witches. Number 3 on this list is Helen Duncan. Helen Duncan was a Scottish witch who traveled throughout Europe and actually isn't that far removed from present day. She died in 1956 and is known by some to be the last Scottish witch. As a young girl, she was considered by most to be a normal, albeit outspoken and loud, growing child. It wasn't until midway through her life that she started seriously practicing witchcraft. Helen garnered a name for herself by regularly performing seances every evening and having the ability to communicate with the dead. During her nightly rituals, she would invite viewers to come and watch. These viewers had reported seeing the materialization of ghostly figures directly in front of their eyes when Helen entered her deep witchly trance. Helen was also capable of and would often excrete a strange-looking ectoplasm from her mouth while she was doing this. And if this wasn't enough, Duncan could also see things that others couldn't. At one point, the ghost of a sailor appeared and talked about a very secretive incident that had happened in World War II that the public, or Helen Duncan, couldn't have possibly known about. After hearing this information, the authorities realized that they couldn't have Duncan revealing any important state secrets about the war and arrested her for witchcraft immediately. It was revealed during her trial that some of her witchy ways were not what people were led to believe though. Like her ectoplasm was simply the regurgitation of a cheesecloth made to look like some type of ghostly substance. Even though some of her abilities were proven to be fraudulent, it still doesn't explain how she was able to accurately predict or say the things that she couldn't have possibly known. Helen Duncan didn't use any of her abilities to harm anyone, but the capability to potentially talk to the dead, it's still very chilling. Number 2 on this list is Thomas Weir and his sister GRIZEL. What makes Thomas and his sister so scary is that nobody expected them to be involved in witchcraft at all. Up until the end of his life, Thomas was known by most to be a nice man of the community held in high esteem. However, nearing the end of his life, Thomas came clean about who he really was, telling the entire community during a religious service that he and his sister had been performing witchcraft for years, going into deep detail about how they had consistent communication with the devil and had devoted their entire lives to carrying out his bidding. This bidding manifested itself in many different ways, most of which involved causing harm to others, or in Thomas's case, getting it on with animals. Yeah. He was a weird dude. At first, the community barely believed him, but after the sister came out and corroborated his story in detail as well, they started piecing it together. Thomas was always walking around with a big black staff. The neighbors had reported hearing strange sounds in the evening coming from their home and weird lights going off. Suddenly, the guy that everybody thought they knew as their nice, friendly neighbor was somebody else entirely. Reports say that when he was burned at the stake, he took far longer to die than a human should. Also, his staff was burned with him, and it emitted an extremely strange sound and moved in unnatural directions when it was burning, as if it was being possessed by some force. I suppose that in the case of Thomas and GRIZEL, they had done such a good job at hiding their identities as witches and had been extremely methodical with their crimes, that before they died, they just had to let the world know just how evil they actually were. Number 1 on this list is Isabel Gowdie. Isabel was a Scottish witch from the 1600s, and frankly, she did everything. Through several confessions that she made on her own accord, without the pressure of torture or coercion from higher ups, Isabel admitted to taking part in a wide array of witchcraft activities. She admitted that she had freely let the devil suck blood from her neck and that she had romantic relationships with the devil before. She admitted to taking the body out of child's graves and using it in a ritual to destroy people's crops. She said that she had made clay effigies or voodoo dolls of someone's children and used these to harm and even kill them. Isabel was also part of a coven, a group of witches whose intentions were evil and had the ability to change their form into animals. She described in detail the brutal murders that she had committed for the devil and her fellow witches. She even offered up information about spells they had used to inflict illnesses on people, uttering some of them to the council she was confessing to. Now, it's unclear exactly why Isabel decided to confess to these heinous crimes and oust herself as being a witch. She had to be aware that confessing to these crimes of this nature would surely mean her execution. It had been said, though, that she felt extreme guilt for her crimes, and that's why she decided to come forward and accept the consequences as they were. Regardless of what her intentions were, though, Isabel Gowdie has to go down as one of the most dangerous known witches in Scottish history. Number 5 on this list is Mary King's Close. Mary King's Close is known to most as being Scotland's most haunted street. It's a very dark and mysterious looking street. I'm not sure if we have any Harry Potter fans watching, but it reminds me of the dark part of Diagon Alley. Just really strong and creepy vibes. It leads off of Edinburgh's Royal Mile, which is the road coming from Edinburgh Castle. This close was apparently gated off in the past during an outbreak of the plague and was left like this for a long time. Only pretty recently has it been reopened, but ever since it has, the reports of hauntings have run rampant. The most commonly spotted spirit here is that of a young girl. Nobody knows her name or why she's there, but she'll often appear holding a little plush bunny rabbit and run through the close. She's said to be devilishly tricky as well and will often steal tiny things off of your person as you pass by without even realizing. Phones, wallets, rings, necklaces, tiny things of this nature are often reported being lost or stolen after walking through the close. Some people think that when this place got bricked up, she was actually forgotten about in here and then died. I'm not sure how someone could possibly have forgotten a little girl here as they were locking it up, but I suppose anything is possible. Either way, it is deeply haunted now, and if you do go, then make sure you leave all your valuables at home. Number 4 on this list is Stirling Castle. Stirling Castle is one of the most haunted castles in all of Scotland's history and is located on top of Castle Hill. Great Castles writes, "The most famous spirit to call Stirling Castle home is the ghost of the Green Lady. Stirling Castle still serves as the home to a garrison, and one evening she delayed dinner in the officers' mess when she materialized behind the chef who was preparing the meal for the soldiers. Feeling as though he was being watched, he turned around only to see her green, translucent form standing behind him, at which time he fainted. She simply vanished on this occasion, but her appearances are usually a harbinger of bad things to come. On several occasions, her visits have occurred shortly before fires or other mishaps at the castle. The ghost of a pink lady sometimes can be seen leaving the castle and walking to the neighboring church of the Holy Rood Ladies' Rock. This was an elevated location where the ladies of the court would go to watch knights participate in jousting tournaments. Some believe the Pink Lady is the ghost of the sole survivor of Edward I's siege of the castle in 1304. Having escaped the siege, she keeps returning to the castle to find her slain husband, though her spirit is seen leaving the castle, not entering. This article then goes on to talk about a ghost of a man with a kilt who lives around the dungeons of this castle and occasionally shows himself to the visitors. But clearly the spirits of this castle are pretty fond of bright colors. The Green Lady, the Pink Lady, I'm kind of surprised that we didn't get a few more ghosts together and we can make a whole freaking rainbow. Even though they are bright and colorful, they are still very scary. In fact, there have been reports of people actually dying of sheer fright before, their corpses looking as if they were petrified to death. It's also believed that if you don't die of fright, then seeing these ghosts is a sign of horrible things to come. Either way, I would recommend avoiding this spot altogether. Scotland has a bunch of other non-haunted castles to visit if you need to get your castle fix in. Number 3 on this list is the Culloden Moor. The Culloden Moor acted as the site for one of Scotland's most infamous and bloody battles in all of history. Christy McIntyre writes, "Many of the ancient battlefields of Scotland are rumored to be plagued by the souls of those who died there. It's not surprising that Culloden, the site one of the most infamous battles in British history, is among them. Over in under an hour, nearly 1,500 Jacobite soldiers were killed, and it remains the last battle fought on British soil. But according to some locals, the battle still rages. Gunfire, swords, and crying are set to echo across the empty moor, particularly on the anniversary of the battle. As well as sounds of combat, the figure of a lone Jacobite soldier reportedly roams the battlefield, wandering in his clan tartan, muttering 'defeated' over and over again as he goes. He's not the only ghostly visitor to this site. Close to the battlefield is the house that Bonnie Prince Charlie, leader of the Jacobite rebellion, slept in the night before the battle. Although now a hotel, it's said that the prince still lingers there wearing full Highland dress, waiting for the battle that will restore him to the throne. Birds are said to never sing or even fly over this area since they can sense the horrible spirits that are still around here. Whenever birds or animals in general want to avoid a certain area, usually it makes me pretty skeptical as well. Animals have a sixth sense about such things and they can feel danger before it's even there. Also, if I'm to avoid any ghosts, then it's always going to be the ones that were slain in battle. These souls have been through hell and are obviously very dangerous. Our soldier could wander around saying defeated, or he could pull out his ghost sword and go to town on you. Not a risk that I am personally willing to take. Number 2 on this list is Overton Bridge. I'm sorry, but this bridge is clearly haunted. Is actually the title of an article written by Amanda Arnold on how freaking haunted this bridge actually is. The bridge is located in the small Scottish town of Dumbarton. Most bridges that we talk about on this channel are haunted by the ghosts of those who have passed away here, or some lady in white that longs for her lover here, or something like that. Not this one though. This bridge actually isn't dangerous at all to humans. It is, however, super dangerous to our best friends. Dogs. Apparently this one little bridge in basically the middle of nowhere has been the host to over 50 dogs taking their own life. Yeah, you heard that properly, a dog taking their own life. In the past 60 years, anywhere from 300 to 600 dogs have thrown themselves over the bridge for no apparent reason, and over 50 of them have died from the fall. Think about that statistic for a second. Like, that's actually kind of crazy. Outsiders believe that there has to be some kind of smell or some property around here that attracts the dogs to the water, but locals believe it's something paranormal. Apparently, even though these spirits are not dangerous to humans, we can still sense them, and people around here have sensed these beings before. It also doesn't seem like a smell that bothers these dogs because they go into a deep trance right before they leap off. At first, she froze, McKinnon told the Times, but then she became possessed by a strange energy and ran and jumped right off the parapet. That was a statement from a dog owner who watched as their dog jumped off the bridge. Locals think that the ghost who is causing these doggy disturbances are from the Lady of Overton. She died here many years ago mourning her husband. I suppose this could be the case, but why is she taking out her grief on dogs? Like, come on lady, let's leave the pups out of this. Anyways, this is definitely a haunted spot, and if you do happen to be walking your dog here, then keep it on a leash. Number 1 on this list is Cawdor Castle. Cawdor Castle is definitely one of the most haunted castles in Europe. It is quite a name for itself because it has a strong connection to one of the most successful stories ever written, Macbeth. This also adds to the lore of this castle's haunting because Macbeth, or the Scottish play, has its own history of haunting surrounding it. Even though this castle is deeply tied in with that story, its haunting doesn't share any connection to the one that plagues Macbeth. This one is centered around the ghost of a woman named Muriel Calder. Muriel Calder was the daughter of the Earl of Calder, who was in charge of the castle in the 18th century. Her ghost is seen at this castle all the time, with most of the sightings taking place in the tallest tower here. There are 2 stories of origin for how she managed to come about, and no one is 100% sure which is the correct one. The first story talks about how she fell in love with someone from a rival clan. A real Romeo and Juliet story where she was deeply in love with someone that she wasn't allowed to see. She would sneak out to see this boy, but eventually her father caught her and punished her for her actions. After learning of her treachery, his rage knew no bounds and he d***ed his daughter. She got away though and ran to the top of the tower, locking the door behind her. Her father wasn't deterred though and broke through, drawing his sword in the process. She tried climbing out the window to safety, but her dad, with one big swing, cut both of her hands off and she fell to her death. The second story doesn't include the dramatic chase up to the tower, but says that he just cut her hands off as punishment so that she could never hold her lover again. Obviously though, with both of her hands sliced off, she couldn't really do much of anything and died from blood loss soon after. Either way, her ghost is now forever restless in this castle and makes itself regularly known to visitors. Obviously, the key identifier of this apparition is her lack of 2 hands.